The time has come for my people to go.
I'm not a queen, I'm a servant of the people. I'm not a king, I'm a servant of the people. It's what the people demand. We gonna keep fighting till we get that land. I'm not a queen, I'm a servant of the people. I'm not a king, I'm a servant of the people. It's time to rise to get what we want. We got to organize.
Greetings, everybody. We hope that you are well and that you are in your highest state of mental, physical, and spiritual health, wherever and whenever you're listening. My name is Jesse, and I'm here with Comrade Salifu to welcome you to another episode of the Pantsula podcast, brought to you by the All-African People's Revolutionary Party. The A-APRP was founded by Kwame Ture in 1968 and is based in Africa. We are a mass Pan-African organization, and our objective is the total liberation and unification of Africa under scientific socialism. If you have any questions about what this means, you can head over to our website at aaprp-intl.org. You can also leave a comment on this video with any questions, concerns, or even criticisms that you may have, and we will get back to you. And thank you for taking the time to listen. And as with every episode, we take this time to acknowledge our ancestors because we understand without them, there would be no us. So, Comrade Salifu, who are the ancestors we're honoring today?
All right, so I'm really excited to talk about the ancestors that we have today. First up, we have Septima P. Clark. Septima P. Clark is also affectionately known as the mother of the civil rights movement. And I'm really excited to talk today about a little about Septima P. Clark because she is from my area. So she was born on May 3rd, 1898 in Charleston, South Carolina. And today she is affectionately known in this area as a community teacher, a fighter of human rights, and a leader of the fight against illiteracy. So Septima P. Clark was born to a mother who was a laundrywoman, and her father was actually a formerly enslaved African. She graduated from secondary school in 1916, passed a teacher's exam, and she was like a part of this big sort of black school movement in South Carolina. So she started on Johns Island, South Carolina, just outside of Charleston, and she taught for more than 30 years. She actually studied in 1937 under W.E.B. Du Bois at Atlanta University. And this woman was passionately dedicated to education, and she also believed in the power of organization, which is why she joined the NAACP. And while she was a part of the NAACP, she participated in this class action lawsuit that the NAACP involved itself in order to get equitable pay for Black and white teachers in South Carolina. In 1956, South Carolina passed this statute that basically prohibited city and state employees from belonging to civil rights organization. That is correct. South Carolina basically said, if you join a civil rights organization, you cannot work for the state or the city. And so because of that, Septima P. Clark was like, well, no, I'm going to continue to organize. I'm going to continue to remain inside of my organization. And because of that, she was fired. Her contract was not renewed. She was barred from teaching because she refused to resign from the NAACP. So when we talk about, the power of organization and why organizations matter, she's a really clear-cut example. She went on to continue her work in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference until like 1970, and then she came back to South Carolina. She was elected to the school board, and it wasn't until 1976 that the governor of South Carolina reinstated her teaching position and reinstated her pension, declaring that she had been unjustly terminated. So she was terminated in 1956. She did not get those rights back or access to any of the money in her teacher's pension until 1976. So that's just how dedicated she was to the cause. When you are, if you're ever in South Carolina and you get started talking to elders, especially in the Charleston area, people will like praise Mama Septima P. Clark down because they either were touched by her as a teacher themselves, or their teacher was somebody that was trained by her. So a very huge and important figure in South Carolina, and very huge and important African woman for people to know more about. The other ancestor that I want to talk about is Zayd Malik Shakur. So Zayd Shakur was the Deputy Minister of Information for the New York chapter of the Black Panther Party. He was always on the move. He was always promoting Black Panther Party programs, without thinking too much about what causes for concern there might be for his own safety. He was a very devoted freedom fighter. His brother was Lumumba Shakur, the Harlem Branch Field Lieutenant, and he was named the lead defendant in the New York Panther 21 indictment. So Zayd was one of the few original New York Panther Party leaders left in the city after the 21 bust. Because he was one of those original figures, he became a major target of COINTELPRO. But it really didn't phase Zayd a lot, because he continued to like assume greater responsibility in party programs. He was moving from New York to Boston to New Haven to Baltimore. And that's because the national leadership really relied on him to guide younger Panthers and community workers that were assigned to the East Coast by the party's national leadership. His friends and people that remember him describe Zayd as somebody that was soft-spoken, and he also hailed from a family of Pan-African activists. So his father was Baba Shakur, who was an elder nationalist mentor to many, including Kwame Ture, one of the key figures in the A-APRP, and who, you know, before he departed to Africa, was also designated the prime minister of the Black Panther Party by the Central Committee. And so if you want to learn more about Zayd Shakur, I definitely recommend you read Assata Shakur's autobiography, because she talks a lot about him. And one of the main points that she makes about Zayd was how he did not fall into the trap of machismo, which some other figures in the party did. She describes Zayd as somebody who was like, you know, not really hell bent on maintaining strict gender roles. When the party would have gatherings where there was food, Zayd would be somebody who would go into the kitchen to clean dishes. He did not tolerate catcalling and misogynistic comments toward women in the organization. And so as this brother who was taking on all these anti-patriarchal stances without even branding himself in that language, because I'm sure he never even like used those kinds of words, I think he sets a really important example for brothers who are trying to organize today. His approach to like building principled relationships with his comrades. People talked about how he avoided petty gossiping and liberalism, which are things that we're all indoctrinated into under capitalism. He maintained this like level of principled comradeship in the face of some really real state suppression. And there's this radio interview where Mutulu Shakur talks about him and talks about how his ability to get along with people and unify under principles made him a very difficult case for COINTELPRO to crack. So at the time that the East Coast and the West Coast Panthers were splitting, Mutulu actually called Zayd the quote contradiction that was difficult for COINTELPRO to resolve. And so, you know, as we continue to propagandize around getting our people into organizations, examples like Zayd help us remember how to be good members of those organizations.
Ashe. Thank you, comrade. That was wonderful. I think, you know, one of the reasons we do these episodes, of course, every time we do an episode, we're honoring an ancestor because they are examples of the work that's been done. And we can look to those that have put in the work, and we honor every day the work that's been done by them. We would not be here if it wasn't for them. And again, they serve as reminders because a lot of times we're laden with the thought that there are no good examples. We can't look to people. And yeah, right. If you're looking at the capitalist media, they're not going to give you an example of someone who's actually put their life on the struggle. But the more we read and we acknowledge the history and the lives of those that have lived before us, we can make a better world. So ashe to all those ancestors. And today, just to get into our episode, we're going to be talking about violence by the state and its different manifestations. And what really made this conversation come on my mind was just kind of going through congress.org or congress.gov actually. You just can look up the recent laws they've been attempting to pass, and just the violence that happens. We're so conditioned to accept it as the norm, and a lot of us are afraid to actually respond to it because we're sort of given the impression that we can't do nothing. We can't come against the police. We can't come against the state. But just as clear by the ancestors we mentioned today and in other episodes, there is a way we can answer this problem. And capitalist systems are of course violent. And I was reading through just this recent motion that's aiming to pass. I believe it's coming from a Florida governor, and it's the Parents Act, the Parents Bill of Rights Act. And I got this article from thepeoplesworld.org, which you can visit. We'll post all the links in the description. And I was going to read some excerpts coming from Mark Gruenberg. And it says, despite its name, the measure H.R. 5 is a Republican messaging bill by panel chair Representative Virginia Fox, a hater of unions, including teachers' unions. Fox offered H.R. 5 to support parents who invade and disrupt school board meetings in the name of their right to ban the teaching of what they consider off-limit subjects such as civil rights and Black history. Parental involvement is critical to developing and sustaining high-quality public schools. We must do all we can to involve parents and break down barriers that prevent or discourage participation, said Bonachimi, a parent, PTA member, and school activist before becoming an Oregon legislator. Language, translation, childcare, and flexible hours and video options for conferencing can make a positive difference. We must speak out against and end the attacks on public education, jeopardizing these essential relationships and threatening to make schools a less welcoming place for Black students and other students of color, students with disabilities, LGBTQI plus students, and other marginalized students. And the article goes on to just talk about how, there's so much going on in terms of how we get our information. And of course, the education system in this country and abroad, when you're looking into the lens of capitalism, it's not really aiming to teach, but to prevent folks from understanding even the history of how we've gotten into this situation. And it sort of clarifies how this war we're in is an ideological war. So while there is the violence of the state from the police, it's also violence from ideologies that benefit capitalism. And we can just see the weak individualism as opposed to socialist Cuba that has the new family code, which is one of those codes is replacing the concept of parental authority with that of parental responsibility. So it just kind of shows the differences of what happens under capitalism when we witness the hyper individuality and there's no thought of collective action. And the focus is just pretty much on one person pulling themselves up when we know historically that's not the case. So that's just kind of how to start. Do you have any thoughts about that? And what could you say about just recent laws like that, HR 5? I mean, also there's the woke, stop woke bill and all these ideological components of misleading the people.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about these things, to be honest with you, comrade, one of the things that it makes me think of is how the hysteria behind it really does a good job at sort of obfuscating, I
Yeah.
think is the word. I don't know how you say it, but like covering up the fact that a lot of what kids had already been learning in public schools is not sufficient, like to begin with. So as far as African children in public schools in the US, I mean, prior to even the hysteria around what is it that they're calling it? What is the panic word that they're using when they talk about racial
Woke.
education?
I used that earlier.
Not woke. I can't for some reason I'm drawing a blank right now, but
Oh, right.
critical race
Yeah.
theory, sorry. Critical race theory, and all these things. To be an African child in a public school in the US, you were already not learning sufficient African history. Your entire curriculum was completely Europe centered, complete erasure of the indigenous people of the Americas. Just like, a few mentions here or there. You were already going from slavery to civil rights to the Holocaust to the Cold War. You know what I mean? Like, it was already structured in a really anti-materialist way. So when we see these things happening, the only thing that it reminds me of is that the purpose of what they're trying to do, which in my opinion, I believe if you look at the situation scientifically, they're trying to create as hostile an environment. The state is trying to create as hostile as an environment as they can inside of public schools, so that parents and local school districts and community members and students, to be quite honest with you, get so fed up with the public school system that the option to privatize everything actually starts to look a lot more appealing,
Right.
if that makes
Wow,
sense.
that's good.
So, let's just make these public schools as unsafe and unfunctioning as possible, so that private corporations, private education think tanks can come in. We can cut them big contracts, and they can, quote unquote, solve the
Right.
problem.
I mean, and that happens so quickly when you think of how folks even look at charter schools and other forms of getting people's attention away from actually dealing with the causes of why students are hungry. I mean, you can't really learn if you don't have access to lunch and other conditions that would need to be in place for education to thrive. So that contradiction is often not missing. And just to your point about like the hostility that is often created and encouraged, because when you have campus officers, who they can't really, just in light of the recent shooting as well, we hear so often, and it's become a normalized situation, that, these school shootings happen, and we get the same typical response from whoever's the president. Oh, we have to do something. We got to ban assault rifles, and we have to, all of these other
Mhm.
minute points that doesn't really speak to the issue. And I'm not even saying that they need to ban guns, because we understand dialectically the purpose of that, but it's always avoiding the main problem so that folks get worked up and not really
Right.
think collectively, so that we don't have to rely on the police or rely on any other force not coming from the people.
Right. And speaking of, like, banning guns and stuff, there was also the recent school shooting in
Yep.
Nashville on Monday, where this like 28-year-old went into a school and killed 3 kids, and 3 adults. It was like a private Christian elementary school. Um, and a part of the way that they're already trying to spin this, especially in looking at the New York Times article about it, is
Yep.
two things. So the first thing is they're using the side door language again, which we just saw in the school shooting before this one. So they're saying this person had detailed writings and like detailed maps of the school and its security protocols, but the way that they were able to get in was through an open side door. And speaking as somebody that works at a school myself, the side door thing is like a thing that is used to push accountability back onto the school. So like the cops get to be like, there's nothing we could have done. There's nothing anybody like, could have done to prevent this. It's the school's fault. They left the side door open. We have all these protocols about like not propping doors open and like, all this stuff. But it's just really convenient because once you say side door, people automatically stop thinking about anything systemic or
Right.
structural, and everything goes right back onto the school. So it was interesting watching this play out a few months ago with a public school and seeing it come back now and being applied to the conditions of a private school. But the other layer that they've added here in terms of trying to have the conversation in the New York Times was really slick with how they tried to throw it in, was to create some like hysteria
Exactly. That's
around
what I was
trans
about to get
people
to.
as
Yeah.
well. So as a Mhm. So you mentioned that earlier with like it's really convenient right now. We're in this moment where we're having all this legislation that's rolling back the rights of trans children, trans youth, trans people in general, and now here comes mainstream media and also like the shooter was transgender, and like, you know, mislabeling the shooter, and like all these things. Not to say that we should actively care about the shooter and their feelings, 'cause I really don't, but these things are always larger signals to the
Right.
trans community in general, in the way that they talk about them. So they know people right now are already in this moment of trans people are participating in sports, trans people are in our bathrooms. How convenient is it then to be like trans people are shooting up our
Yeah,
streets?
no, it
You know what I
follows the
mean?
same hysteria. I mean, this is why when folks engage in these conversations on social media in an unprincipled manner, there's a lot of, we're not getting through when you're not looking at the dialectical, historical, materialist lens, because just to blame trans folks and to blame the LGBTQ community for any act of violence, again, it doesn't really acknowledge the contradiction of living in a violent state and how the police and how we're surveyed. There's surveillance here, and we're not. It's not like George Jackson said, fascism isn't coming, it's here. Like we're dealing with the appendages of violence every day, but the way we're socialized to make them normal and then make ourselves the enemy, pointing to one person or one group as opposed to understanding the structural system. It's operating as it is intended, because even in how this conversation has been talked about recently, I hear a lot of folks putting faith that if we were to somehow vote in the system to somehow change it from within, or um, not have the collective interest so much, but just wait on someone to give us a promise, and just, we enter, how many times do we have to enter into that pattern again of accepting the status quo, because it's operating as it's intended, just to keep us numb to the systematic issue. And I just find it interesting that the more and more these situations happen, the more deeper we get into the alienation and the fear that is expected to come about it. I mean, it's just also reminded me of, being in this organization has really helped me, because before, obviously I did have some sort of distaste for America in particular, but I wasn't able to connect it globally and see that, what I'm experiencing is not different from anyone in South America or in Mali or in Chad or anywhere where Africans are. Like, this is a global enemy that we're dealing with. And, reading and studying and going through the books and learning the true history of how we've gotten to this situation uh, puts context, that none of these things are accidental, and they all connect when we acknowledge these contradictions. And we don't have to be afraid of the things that have worked. We can look at the past and study organizations of folks that have put in the work to demonstrate that there's a way to arise above it, and not to just be afraid of taking action, because I think a lot of folks, it's scary to read these actions if you're not well versed into believing that there can be anything done about it. If you think, well, this is just how it is, I ain't gonna step away from it. I don't want to get shot, right? And it's like, well, you could get shot even if you don't decide to do anything about it. Why not? Like the
Right,
action.
right.
I remember on one of the podcasts recently, I believe you were mentioning that too, like to do an evaluation of why things are the way they are. We all share the same sort of pain within this system. We know what it's like, and obviously, with class distinctions aside, we still understand like this system, they're killing us. We all have these same problems. So, what can we do collectively
Right.
to address those problems so that we're not alone in the thought that nothing can be done? All we got to do is, get money uh, and somehow, you know, build ourselves economically as opposed to who we are as social beings.
Right. And I think that is a part of the hard truth that a lot of people living in the US who have their identity wrapped up in being quote unquote American really don't want to grapple with, but like have to grapple with the entire existence of quote unquote America, because we understand the Americas is a
Right.
freaking continent. But that whole idea of being American, the bedrock of it is violence. You cannot escape that. Like when we talk about having an analysis of imperialism, you have to understand that you live in a settler colony. The way that settler colonies are established is through violence. So the very beginning of the foundation of this country was violent. And so then for us to
Right.
live in it every day on a mental, emotional, and psychological level, we have to accept, even if at 1%, that violence against people who helpless people is warranted. Like it's like okay, in some instances it's for the better good. And as long as that remains a part of our psyche, as long as we live in a country where first person shooter games are incredibly popular among children, as long as we live in a society where the US military is the number one purveyor of violence and terror around the world, and every contradiction that the United States seeks to quote unquote resolve around the world is solved through bombs, is solved through
Right.
drone strikes, is solved through sending troops and boots on the ground. That's always going to Violence is always going to be a part of the country that we live in. And so we can't continue to like go through this cycle of a school was shot, I'm shocked and surprised. Women are being abused in domestic violence relationships, I'm
Right.
shocked and surprised. Hate crimes are increasing against African and Asian and queer people, like I'm shocked and surprised. We have to get out of that because that is the foundation of our daily
Right.
lives.
And that's the point. I mean, the foundation. You can't expect to start off violent and it's just going to somehow get better. And they write these laws, they make these policies to ensure businesses are protected and to ensure the hegemonic power of the people is, or I should say, their hegemonic power is brought over the will of the people, and they're not going to use, or they can use any medium to get your attention. I mean, if it's to use somebody who works in a petty bourgeois class, or to take, your favorite theme and to present that in a way, they're very clever in how they use the psychological warfare against us. And yeah, it's time for us to just take the action and call and be responsible for what's happening, because at this point, we really, I mean, we stress organization all the time every time we do these episodes, because we understand that organization is so important to, I mean, it decides everything. Like, it decides how you're going to go by even structuring your life when you understand the contradictions of living in this system. And I think for a lot of folks, it's also just kind of what happens to them personally. Maybe somebody they knew was involved in something like that, or they personally was involved. And then it starts hitting home like, oh, this could happen to me. And it's like, yeah, it's happening to all of us, and to harp the state's point of making us antagonistic towards each other and to fight against amongst ourselves, to divide and conquer, are like the COINTELPRO love to do with organizations, sowing discord and creating lies and confusion, and liberalism thriving because people are not able to talk to each other directly. Like, those same examples are brought out today, even in social media and other forms of communication. And so it has to be a clear, once knowledge comes in, it's like I remember watching a speech from Kwame Ture, and he was talking about, when you hear knowledge, you don't forget. It's not like you can go back once that call of action has been brought out to the center. And it's to your point of what you were saying. Like, I think a lot of us, we know this on a deep level, but we're inspired all the time from the television and from our phones and all these other places of media, that we can be the example. We can stand out. You can be the one. You don't have to have the broke mentality like your homies. You can actually go out and do it. And they use the remnant, just a small amount of people who have managed to escape, but still depend on white supremacy to go forward. Like, we've learned through folks like Kanye West and all these other people who might access some form of wealth, what happens to that wealth once you go over their line. Like, it ain't like none of this is promised to you. There's no, if you don't own the means of production, you're not even a capitalist. So that's another point. But just to even have what you would have, and to think that that's enough for you to survive, and as long as you're okay, it's like you in for one when the revolution comes, which you know we know.
Right. And so I just think it goes without saying that, like, until we seriously organize against imperialism, we cannot change this culture. There is no reality where the United States is still around the world sanctioning and causing death and destruction, dropping bombs, using drones, and that's all happening on the outside, and on the inside things are clean and pristine. It's never going to happen. So that's why I feel like we always talk about imperialism being the primary contradiction that has to be resolved, so that we can create a world where kids can go to school and be safe and be welcomed and receive, the appropriate, not the appropriate, but like optimal education that fulfills them and nourishes them and grows their brains, develops their critical thinking skills, and helps them to be able to contribute to solving some of the large crises that we have in the world today. And I think that first of all, we know that building alternatives is going to be one of the steps that we have to take to get to that point. And we can see that in countries like Cuba and China, for example, where in China, children are learning dialectics from the moment they enter the school system. Think about how fundamentally different that is than some of the ways that kids are taught to think and behave in school in the United
Right.
States.
Like imagine going to school and learning about dialectical materialism as a kid. Like it just helps I mean, what that does to your emotional responsibility. A lot of folks, I mean, this is amazing to know the differences in education and how, if you start early teaching human beings, teaching children this stuff, they take it with them when they get older, as opposed to like, oh, well, we are all savages at the heart and we all are competitive and we all want dominance. So if someone takes something from you, then you get, it's just a different language, and it brings about a different habit of behavior.
Right. Which is why the US has to go so hard to denounce the quote unquote like horrors of socialism, because they have to provide cover for the contradictions of capitalist society.
Yeah. Like, I mean, it's just the same thing with, just reading up on the horrors of socialism was really interesting, because going back to what we've been talking about, like this is an ideological war. And because we are in a violent capitalist system, it's constantly giving us the reproduction of that violence. So if it comes from police, if it comes from the television, like everything being political and everything having a policy attached or some form of justification to allow the poverty that exists. I mean, if they wanted to really change the state of folks, they don't even care about the people who are involved in their wars once they come back. So, I mean, clearly a decision that they are allowing on purpose to maintain their power. And so, yeah, they have to look at other places that have socialist ideologies and demonize them and say, oh no, the people, they have food lines and they don't have access to this, not to mention the sanctions or embargoes or any of the act of violence that we even experience being in the belly of the beast. Like, see, people out here are having to go to food banks too. It's not like everyone out here got access to food. Food isn't free. And so these contradictions come up ever so often, but they're missed, I think, because again, by diverting, it's like what they're doing with the TikTok thing in China. Like what other way to make one antagonistic towards the Chinese, and to like, when we see the hate crime that is rising and the justification for that is embedded in the policies.
Right. And it's like very similar to what you were mentioning with HR 5, where this is the kind of legislation that's coming out of the United States. Meanwhile, in Cuba, which is a socialist country, there's the new family code.
And the new family code goes into that, like just the protection of, like, children have a voice. They're not just like, subjugated to what the parent may want. Because what if their parent is spouting harmful ideology, which we see happen all the time? Kids who are LGBTQ not having not feeling safe enough to announce that to their parents because they know what that could look like. And we know what the state and what that type of mindset does to folks who are dealing with that. They don't feel comfortable. They don't feel safe.
Right.
So I mean, this is an ideological war. This is
Right.
something that, as you said to your point, we should be passed upon a surprise because this is how it started. It started out in that, and so we can look at examples like you said, looking at socialist countries like Cuba and China and places that have fought. And we're not going to always get it right. I think it's important to also acknowledge. I recently was having conversations with some other comrades on a recent anti-patriarchy meeting. We were talking about this article that talked about how, traveling to a socialist country like Cuba, there are a lot of internalized imperialism that we all have. And we have all these criticisms for Cuba and, oh, these things they're getting wrong, these things they're not getting right. But it's like we're having to build this thing. We're not going to get it all right. But that's the point, to make mistakes so that we get better. So to just be like, nah, it can't happen, or nah, you know, this somebody didn't get justice in this part. It's like you're gonna make mistakes. We're gonna make mistakes. I mean, that's why we're building this thing. But to act as if there should be no process, there should be no will to continue, is again speaking to that internalized imperialism and the justifications we give for capitalism. But then when we see someone trying and we see them make a mistake, we want to think that it's impossible or can't be done.
Exactly. Exactly. And so, I think for me, I guess the final point that I want to make is that when it comes to thinking about state violence, we have to move away from these reactionary understandings of state violence. We have to understand that violence is baked into the nature of the capitalist state. And until we sufficiently organize ourselves into a mass people's movement, which can wrestle power away from that capitalist state in order to replace that power with a state that is driven by the people, a worker state, a dictatorship of the proletariat, whatever you want to call it. Um, these contradictions will continue, and until Africa is free, Africans and African children, African women, African men will continue to be at the whim
Yeah,
of imperialism.
point blank. I mean, and that's why we say, and if you want to help make that a reality, I mean, we all need, and that's the point. Like we're called the All African People's Revolution, all Africans. Like it don't matter where you are and who you are, who you identify as, what pronouns you use. We need all Africans to fight this, and
All hands on
we're
deck.
so we say all the time, join an organization that's fighting for justice and develop some PE, and get some understanding of what's happening. Have that political education, understanding what's happening around the world. And it's never too late to learn something. It's never too late to understand that what's happening before or what's happening right now can be informed by what we're doing and what we're doing to to deal with this worldwide struggle against imperialism and patriarchy and capitalism and all of these forms of um, struggle and enemies to humanity. So join an organization. And did you have anything else you want to add besides that point?
Nope. Join the
Fighting for
organization.
justice. And we also want to thank you for listening, taking the time to listen to this episode. We want to remind you that there are several other comrades doing the work. Be sure to check out our ancestors' voices, the weekly Pan African news, and the Forward Ever podcast, which is on Spotify. And we also encourage folks to support our Forward Ever shop on Etsy, where you can wear with no despair a call to revolutionary action as we say, forward ever, backwards never.